Emily's hand crashed across my face, sharp and violent, as if someone had hurled a stone straight into my heart. "Shut up! You don't deserve to say his name," she hissed at me right at the courthouse gate. Clay stood beside her, smirking, as he tossed a pitch-black USB at my feet. "In here is enough to bury Daniel and you along with him." But just a heartbeat later, both of them froze when the clerk's voice rang out. "Federal Judge Margaret Hale, please proceed to the bench." The air cracked like shattered glass. Emily went pale. Clay choked on his breath. And I simply stood there watching the two people who had just humiliated me kneel beneath the very law they planned to use to bury me and my son. If you were me, would you forgive or return that slap with justice? Comment continue and follow to hear the next part where everything explodes 10 times harder. I still remember that morning, the thin sunlight falling across my porch like a pale coat of paint trying to cover the cracks in my life. But for a woman who has lived more than 60 years like me, some cracks can never be covered. I am Margaret Hale, 62 years old, dark-skinned, and old enough to know that peace always comes at a cost, and the cost I chose was to hide. I held the title of senior federal judge, but I withdrew from the spotlight, kept silent, and refused all trials unless summoned. I didn't want anyone in this town to know I still had the authority to pass judgment. I didn't want anyone looking at me with fear or curiosity. After my husband died, I only wanted to live like a quiet shadow so the grief wouldn't be stirred again. But darkness is not always enough to hide a whole life. And I felt that clearly the day Emily stepped into my family with a smile cold enough to raise goosebumps. I never believed Emily liked me, but her hostility wasn't the kind you hide behind politeness. It showed in every glance, every small sentence that sounded casual but cut like a blade. I still remember the first time I looked into Emily's eyes. There was no warmth of a loving wife, no respect for a mother-in-law, only calculation too thick to conceal. Emily brushed her hair back, looking at Daniel as if he were a possession she had absolute control over. Then she tilted her head toward me and released a sentence that tightened my chest. "Daniel listens to me. Don't interfere." There was no mockery in her voice, which made it worse. It was certainty, the certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was steering the story. Daniel, my only son, stood there with the look of a man who loved his wife so deeply he couldn't see what was wrong. And that look frightened me the most. When a man loves the wrong person, he cannot distinguish between sweet poison and gentle lies. I tried to stay calm. I had once sat before defendants far more dangerous than Emily. I knew how to read people to tell liars from the desperate. And Emily was the sort who, once she wanted something, would get it at any cost, no matter who got hurt along the way. I told myself maybe I was being too sensitive. That women sometimes overreact to things that seem harmless. But every time I tried to reassure myself, the haze in Emily's eyes grew darker, denser, and more dangerous. Then Clay appeared like a warning sign before disaster. He was the kind of white cop who could drain half the air from a room just by walking in. His eyes looked at everyone as if they owed him something. And when that look fell on me, I knew I wasn't mistaken. An old woman like you will shake when you stand in court later. He didn't say it as a warning. He said it like a promise. There are men whose posture alone reveals they're used to dirty power. Clay was one of them. He stood slightly leaning toward Emily, as if an invisible thread tied them together. Daniel walked into the room with a naive smile, unaware he was standing in the middle of an undercurrent. I kept silent, trying to steady myself. I had been away from the judicial bench long enough to know that silence is sometimes safer than confrontation. But silence can also turn undercurrents into storms. Emily stepped closer to Clay, her head bent toward him, her voice low but clear enough for me to hear. Prepare for step 2. My heart tightened. Fragments of old memories, cases I had judged, people I had seen walk into wrongdoing, all rushed back at once. I knew that look. I knew that tone. I knew the kind of schemes that could grow from one whisper like that. And I knew my life was about to be torn open again. But this time, not because of my husband's death. This time because my son was standing right at the center of a storm he couldn't even see. I stood still, looking at the gray sky beyond the window, sensing that the peace I had built for years was about to shatter. I didn't yet know what step 2 meant for Emily and Clay, but I knew one thing: it wasn't for anything good. And I knew that no matter how I tried to avoid it, fate had begun pulling me back toward the very chair I had tried hardest to escape. This chapter ends with that realization, with the moment I sensed the first fracture in my fragile peace, with Emily's whisper sharp as a needle piercing the shell I had built around my quiet life for so many years, and I realized the storm had already begun. The afternoon sky sank into a heavy gray, as if warning that something was about to slip out of control. After that strange encounter between Emily and Clay, I returned home with a discomfort crawling beneath my skin. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and reviewed Daniel's financial records, which I had quietly monitored for months. Living alone had taught me to observe in silence rather than interfere. But when I saw my son's name repeating across accounts with unclear origins, that silence began to crack. I leaned back in my chair. The columns of numbers flickered before my eyes like relentless knocks on the door. A transaction of $300,000 labeled as an investment from a fund under Emily's name. The terrifying part wasn't the amount, but the way it was executed. The money passed through 3 intermediary accounts before settling neatly under Daniel's portfolio, as if someone was erasing their tracks and pushing everything toward the most innocent person in the room. I zoomed in on the document, scanning details ordinary people would never notice, but I was different. I had judged dozens of complex financial cases, and I recognized the stench of dirty money when it hit my face. Daniel walked into the house while I was staring at the screen. His smile made my heart clench. How could someone like him get tangled in this? I asked gently without revealing what I'd discovered. Daniel only smiled and said Emily told him it was an incredible investment opportunity, the kind that could change a life. I clenched my hands, looking at the calloused fingers of the son who once clung to my skirts, now being led down a path he didn't understand. Emily appeared right after, her heels striking the floor like warning beats. She stepped beside Daniel, placing a possessive hand on his shoulder. I repeated my question, this time more clearly. Why was Daniel's name on that investment? Why did the sub-account show her signature? Emily tilted her head at me as if I had asked something foolish. Then she spoke slow and poisonous, dripping into my ears. Jail or not, Daniel still belongs to me. My heart faltered, not because of her words, but because of Daniel's eyes when he heard them. I saw him stiffen, but instead of anger or doubt, he forced a small smile to ease the tension. Men like Daniel always choose the woman they love over the truth, and Emily knew that far too well. I returned to my room, trying to steady myself as the numbers continued to dance chaotically on the screen. Multiple large transfers appeared in a single night, 5 altered digital signatures, 2 unverified accounts, all pointing to one final destination, Daniel Carter. It was too soon to conclude anything, but the small pieces were aligning into a picture I didn't want to see. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker like the final breaths of peace. By sunrise, I had already made my decision. I needed to uncover the truth with my own hands. I printed the documents and stepped outside, the morning chill brushing against my face like a reminder that truth always comes with a price. Daniel sat in the living room, a cup of coffee in hand, but his eyes distant. I placed the papers on the table. "You need to explain this." Daniel barely had time to react before a hard knock sounded at the door. I knew that sound. It was the knock of someone who didn't come for pleasantries. The door opened and Officer Clay stood there, his presence blocking the light. I saw that familiar smirk. He held out a folded paper. I didn't need to read the header to understand what was happening. Clay spoke in a calm, chilling voice. "Daniel Carter, you are summoned to a preliminary hearing. Be present tomorrow morning." I stood still, feeling the ground shift beneath me. Daniel looked lost. Clay set the paper on the table and glanced at me, his eyes sealing the fate of whatever piece I had left. And in that moment, I knew the trap had been completed. All that remained was for the prey to step in. I stared at the summons lying cold on the table and understood that Emily and Clay's plan had entered its next stage. The next morning opened with a pale light matching Daniel's mood. He sat quietly on the chair, the summons still lying neatly on the table like a cold blade. I stood in the kitchen waiting for the water to boil, though my mind was elsewhere. What troubled me wasn't only the nature of the summons, but Clay's words when he handed it over. No lawyer needed, just a small procedure. It sounded like a pat on the head, but in his tone, I heard contempt. A sentence I had heard many abusers of power use to trick people who didn't understand the law. I walked toward Daniel and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You need a lawyer. You cannot go there alone." Daniel bit his lip, eyes lowered as his fingers trembled slightly. He spoke softly like a child admitting fault. "Clay said it's nothing big, Mom. He said I shouldn't stress." I closed my eyes for a second. Clay understood Daniel's psychology too well. My son always trusted what made things feel less frightening, and Clay used that weakness like a patient predator. When I stepped into my office to retrieve the printed documents, my heart tightened as I noticed the drawer was open. The stack of papers I printed last night had vanished. I stood still for several seconds, unwilling to believe what I had realized. No one but Clay had entered my home yesterday during that moment when I was still reeling from the summons. He had confiscated everything, leaving Daniel to walk into the hearing empty-handed. Daniel appeared behind me, sounding confused. "Are you looking for something, Mom?" I swallowed the rising anger in my throat, refusing to scare him further. "Your documents are gone. Someone took them." Daniel glanced around as if hoping they would reappear, but reality remained cold as the floor beneath our feet. He rubbed the back of his neck, stress showing in every line of his face. Maybe someone mixed them up. I looked at my son, aching for him. Daniel always tried to believe the better explanation, but that instinct would drive him deeper into this trap. When I drove Daniel to the courthouse parking lot, a chill crawled up my spine. This wasn't a family issue anymore. This was a game Clay had prepared step by step. He stood a few meters away, arms crossed, his smile hollow and victorious. I heard Daniel's steps slow behind me. He was trying to breathe steadily. I wanted to take him home, shield him, but it was too late. The preliminary hearing had been scheduled, and Daniel was required to appear. Clay approached, his voice even and instructive. "Follow me. This is just a confirmation procedure. It'll be quick." Daniel nodded mechanically. I stepped forward, blocking them. "He needs a lawyer." Clay glanced at me, his eyes darkening briefly. You don't know the law better than I do. This is simply the first step to clarify things. If he didn't do anything wrong, he'll walk out immediately. I looked into his eyes. That's what you want people to believe. He gave a thin smile that reminded me of the men I once sent to prison, the kind who believed that a show of power could silence everyone. Tomorrow, Daniel will fall. Be there to watch. His voice sank into a venomous murmur, as if carving the words into my chest. Daniel heard him, but tried to dismiss it as mere bravado. I looked at my son, and I knew the ruthless truth was coming much faster than he understood. We returned home before the hearing. Daniel stayed silent the entire ride, clutching the summons tightly. I didn't speak either, because every word could make him more anxious. I sat on the couch while Daniel went into his room, his eyes pleading for everything to stop. Life doesn't stop just because we fear it. I checked my phone for the time and saw a new message appear. A short line, yet enough to show how deep the shadows behind this story were. The message was from Emily. Be on time. The air around me thickened, as if Emily had just placed her hand on my shoulder and pushed me toward the very center of the storm she and Clay had prepared. I stared at the glowing message on the screen and realized tomorrow's hearing wasn't meant to clarify anything, but to pull Daniel straight into the final trap they had set. The morning of the preliminary hearing opened with a cutting cold, as if the ground itself was holding its breath before collapsing. I held Daniel's elbow as we walked up the steps leading to the city courthouse. The crowd wasn't large, but the rhythm of shoes, cars, and scattered conversations made the whole space feel heavy, as if everything was being pulled toward us. Daniel stayed silent, head lowered, gripping the summons so tightly the paper edges wrinkled. And I, though trying to stay composed, felt my worries knot tighter with every breath. I turned to Daniel, ready to say something to ease him, when I saw Emily standing at the courthouse gate, her eyes sharp enough to feel like a blade. She stood there as though she had been waiting for this moment. Her face showed unmistakable satisfaction, a twisted joy, as if Daniel and I were two chess pieces walking exactly into the square she had arranged. I called out, my voice filled with a helplessness I could no longer hide. Daniel. My voice barely reached him before Emily lunged forward, her tone ripping through the air like an animal cornered. Shut up! You don't deserve to say his name! I didn't even have time to react before her hand swept across my face so fast it sliced through the air. Slap! The sound cracked sharp and dry, and I felt as if someone had hurled a stone straight into my heart. My cheek burned, but the pain wasn't on my skin. It was deeper in the place where a mother's dignity had just been shattered in front of strangers. I staggered back a step. People around us stopped to stare, but none of them understood that in that moment, my world tilted as if someone was trying to bend every piece of my life out of shape. I looked at Daniel. He was just an arm's length away. He had seen everything. He had heard everything. And he lowered his head, his shoulders trembling, fear etched across his face. It wasn't fear of Emily or fear for me. It was fear of Clay. Daniel knew Clay could destroy his life with a single sentence. Daniel didn't step toward me. He didn't speak. He didn't move. That sight hurt more than the slap. Before I could steady myself, Clay approached, his steps full of smug confidence, as if he were walking on a stage he built. In his hand was a pitch-black USB, small but radiating the foul odor of danger. He stood in front of me, looking down with the cold eyes of a man who believed power was a shield. Not for the court, Clay said, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through my thoughts. He released his fingers. The USB fell to the ground, landing near the tip of my shoe. For you, so you'll know how Daniel will be buried." His words felt like a shovel digging deeper into my fear. I stared at the USB, a chill racing down my spine. I knew immediately this was not legal evidence, not something that could be presented in court. It was psychological warfare, a weapon used by men who preferred breaking spirits before breaking lives. Daniel whispered, "Mom, don't pick it up," but his voice trembled with desperation. I bent down, not out of fear, but because I knew if I didn't face this now, tomorrow would be much worse. When I picked up the USB, Emily's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. Her eyes said everything. The game had entered the point of no return, and I was merely an onlooker to the ruin of my family. I closed my fingers around the USB, feeling as if I were holding a shard of glass, sharp enough to tear apart the last hope I had been clinging to. I didn't know what it contained, but I knew without doubt that it was created for one purpose: to destroy Daniel and to destroy me along with him. Yet somewhere inside me, something stirred. A buried instinct awakened, the instinct I had forced underground since leaving the judiciary, an instinct that rises only when a mother sees her child pushed to the edge of a cliff. I opened my laptop in the corner of the hallway, my hand trembling slightly as I plugged in the USB. Files popped up one after another. Every file pointed to a conclusion I didn't want to believe. Inside the USB, Daniel was framed as the mastermind behind the entire money laundering operation. I stared at the forged files flooding the screen, realizing that if I didn't act in time, tomorrow Daniel would be shoved into the abyss Emily and Clay had carved for him. I sat tucked into a corner of the hallway, the laptop resting on my lap, the sting from Emily's slap still lingering across my cheek. But that pain meant nothing compared to what appeared before me when I opened the USB. Files burst onto the screen one after another, lines of data scrolling like blades slicing straight into my chest. Each document was constructed with frightening precision, the kind that would instantly convince an outsider that Daniel was the mastermind of an elaborate money laundering network. I stared at the money flow diagrams, the digital signatures, the records stamped with Daniel's name at every crucial point. Not a single figure or line was left untouched. Everything had been molded into a fabricated narrative, written by a hand that understood the law, understood every gap that could trap an innocent person. I gripped the corner of the keyboard, fighting to keep my hand steady. But each rising file pounded inside my head like someone was trying to drown me under dark water. I scrolled to the end of one report. A full model of the supposed criminal operation came into view, and at the center was Daniel's photo, labeled Primary Operator. My eyes burned. My son, who worked in a factory and had never handled a large contract in his life, was now being portrayed as the leader of a criminal ring. My fingers clenched, and a hollow ache opened inside my chest. Whoever created this knew exactly how to shatter a family and exactly how to make me collapse. I clicked away from the report just to catch my breath, but at that moment, I heard soft footsteps behind me, light like a breeze. Emily was standing not far from where I sat, her eyes fixed on me like a snake studying its prey. I didn't want her to see the weakness in my face, but before I could close the laptop, she leaned in, her lips forming a cold curve. She spoke, and her voice, though quiet, landed like a stone plunging to the bottom of my heart. Whether Daniel lives or dies doesn't matter, as long as he stays silent. There was no shouting, no theatrical menace. Emily said it with calm indifference, which was the most terrifying thing of all. I lifted my eyes to her face, the same face Daniel had once called family. And in that moment, I understood that she no longer saw Daniel as a person. He was an obstacle, a shadow to erase so she could step into a life where no one questioned the filthy money behind her. I wanted to confront her, to say something, but my throat locked. Every cell in my body began to shake with anger. Not the kind that flares and fades. This was a deep, simmering anger, the kind I had seen in mothers who walk into courtrooms to defend their children. In that moment, I knew I was no longer an observer. I had to do what I had avoided for years, rise and fight. I turned back to the laptop, scrolling to the very bottom of the file list. There was a small folder, smaller than the rest, with a name that stood out, Master File. I opened it. Inside weren't dozens of documents like I expected. Just a data log, a short note, and one name. A name I had never heard before, yet it sent a chill crawling down my spine. C. Brooks, Evidence Master. I stopped breathing for a beat. I didn't know why, but I felt that name mattered. Someone had left a trace that Emily and Clay didn't foresee, as if a third hand had been involved, or as if the person who created this USB wasn't entirely on their side. I opened the note, but it contained only lines of technical commands, no explanation. Still, the appearance of a real name in a crafted lie was unusual. When someone is confident enough to sign their work, they might be a lead or a warning. I lifted my head from the screen, and that was when I saw him. A man standing at the end of the hallway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the tiles like a heavy punctuation mark. He didn't move closer, but his eyes were fixed on me. Not with threat, not with curiosity, but with the gaze of someone waiting for me to realize I was not walking through this alone. I stared straight at the man, sensing that a door to a far larger secret was opening right in front of me. He stood at the end of the hallway like a shadow cut away from the rest of the building. The light from the window behind him cast a glow across his shoulders, making his silhouette even more mysterious. I closed my laptop, slipped the USB into my coat pocket, and tightened my grip on my bag strap as a reflex of self-defense. When I looked again, the man had already crossed half the hallway. His footsteps echoed steadily on the stone floor, unhurried, yet heavy enough to make my heart pound. When he stood a few steps from me, I finally saw his face clearly. A broad forehead, deep but alert eyes, and the tired expression of someone who had lived too long with a truth no one believed. He didn't extend a hand, didn't greet with pleasantries. Instead, he spoke immediately in a low, firm voice, carrying the urgency of a man who entered a battle with no path back. "Margaret, you're being trapped. I have evidence the FBI doesn't want leaking out." Hearing my own name from a stranger startled me. My breath caught for a second. No one here knew I still had authority to sit on a federal bench, nor did anyone know I had quietly begun investigating this mess days ago. I clenched the edge of my bag to hide the tension rising in my chest. "How do you know my name?" He didn't answer, only held my gaze as if testing whether I had enough courage to continue. Emily had heard the voice and turned around, irritation flashing across her face. She closed the distance between herself and Brooks with a single dagger-sharp look. "Who told you you could be here?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the disdain of someone who believed the entire hallway fell under her control. Brooks glanced at her, calm to the point that his calmness felt like a silent slap. He didn't respond to her immediately, as though her words weren't worth acknowledging. Then he turned back to me, pulling a small hard drive from his briefcase, its federal seal still intact. The printed ink had faded slightly, but I recognized the emblem instantly. He placed it in my hand, his grip firm, as if passing not only evidence, but a weight of responsibility. "This is the real data. Daniel is the victim. Emily and Clay are the masterminds." For a moment, the hallway froze. The hum of the air conditioner, the distant footsteps of guards, Everything seemed pressed into silence by that one sentence. Emily stepped back slightly, her lips trembling, though she tried to mask it. She flicked her eyes toward me, measuring how much I believed. I stared at the hard drive. The cold metal seeped into my skin, tightening my chest. I knew I was holding something that could turn the entire case on its axis. I whispered to Brooks, careful not to let Emily hear. "Why are you helping me?" Brooks answered with a look sharp as a blade just unsheathed. "Because if you don't stand up, no one will, and I've watched this case long enough to know you're the only person capable of confronting them." His words poured over me like cold water. A part of me wanted to step back, hide, retreat into the shell I had lived in after my husband died. But when I looked toward Daniel, curled near the hallway's entrance with confusion written across his face, I knew I had no place left to run. Emily suddenly stepped toward us, desperate to regain control. "Put that drive down. You don't even know who he is. He could be fabricating things just like Daniel." She masked her fear with harshness, but beneath the layers of makeup and false confidence, I saw the raw panic beginning to surface. Brooks turned to her for the first time, looking at her as if seeing straight through her skin. "I'm the one you least wanted to meet." There was something in his eyes that made Emily instinctively step back. I opened my mouth to ask him another question, but at that moment, the courtroom bell rang throughout the hallway. The sound was sharp, final, and though small, heavy as a verdict. People began moving, the courtroom doors swung open, and the white lights poured onto the tile floor. Brooks locked eyes with me, giving a small nod as if signaling that the real battle began now. And Emily turned away, swallowing the fear she couldn't hide. The bell of the preliminary hearing echoed, and I understood that the truth I had just received could save my son, but could also mark me as the next target. The door of the hearing room closed behind us, leaving a thick silence hanging in the air like chalk dust suspended in the white lights. I sat beside Daniel, my hand gripping the hard drive Brooks had given me, feeling every worry press against my ribs like shallow breaths. Daniel kept his head down, fingers interlocked, trembling so lightly it seemed each movement might send his life crashing down another level. Brooks entered the room, his shoes striking the stone tiles with a firmness that seemed to wake the entire chamber from the false reality Emily and Clay had wrapped it in for weeks. He removed his glasses, exchanged a brief glance with me, then walked directly to the evidence table with the decisiveness of a man who had nothing left to lose. A new hard drive was placed on the table, its federal seal intact, as though he had lifted it straight from a government vault. Permission to submit supplemental evidence. His voice was soft, but firm enough to make Emily freeze at the back of the room. Clay stood beside her, his face paling, trying to appear calm, though his hand clenched the edge of his chair. The hearing judge reviewed the seal, then nodded. Brooks connected the hard drive to the projector, and within seconds a recording echoed through the room. Emily's voice came first, sharp and cold, like the metal edge of a knife freshly pulled from stone. "Throw Daniel in prison. The old woman will die off on her own." Daniel's head shot up, eyes wide, while a crushing pressure tightened in my chest. Then Clay's voice followed, low and poisonous. "Once the kid's gone, whatever money you want, I'll handle it." The courtroom fell silent. No one moved. Even the clerk's pens hovered midair. Emily stood as if the blood had drained entirely from her body, her lips stiff and pale. Clay glanced at her, panic flashing across his face before he tried and failed to mask it. The judge stopped the recording, then spoke a sentence that made my knees nearly buckle with relief. "With this new evidence, the court dismisses all charges against Daniel Carter." Daniel exhaled a strangled breath, something between a gasp and a sob. I took his hand, feeling warmth return to him for the first time in days. Daniel Carter is no longer a defendant, the judge continued, each word cutting through Emily and Clay's scheme like a blade. The formal trial is hereby reassigned as the criminal case against Emily Carter and Officer Clay Morgan for abuse of authority, fabrication of evidence, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. I looked at the two people who had tried to destroy my son's life. Emily burst into tears, not tears of remorse, but of a loser unable to accept exposure. Clay jerked up from his chair, but 3 officers stepped forward, instantly forcing him back down. Daniel turned to me, confusion and gratitude blurring together in his eyes, like someone rescued from the cliff's edge, but not yet able to stand. I stroked the back of his hand. "You're safe now." Brooks approached when the hearing ended. His expression was calm, but there was a warmth in his eyes I hadn't expected from a man who had walked out of the shadows. I asked the question that had lived in my chest since he handed me the hard drive. "Why are you helping me, Brooks?" He inhaled deeply, looking upward as though gazing at a distant point in his past. "Your husband once saved my life." His voice dropped, roughened by something old. "I'm simply paying back what I owe." A cold breeze swept through the room from the cracked door, carrying the feeling that something had closed, but something much larger was about to open. I looked down at the hard drive, knowing that without it, Daniel might have vanished from this world as if he never existed. Footsteps rushed down the hallway. The clerk appeared in the doorway, clutching a stack of files, her voice ringing clear and firm like a bell cutting through a cathedral. "Federal Judge Margaret Hale, please preside over the formal trial." I stood still, my hand resting on Daniel's, as I realized I was no longer outside this storm. I was about to return to the very seat fate had been pulling me toward. I stood before the tall wooden door of the courtroom, its polished surface reflecting my face like that of another woman, no longer the quiet mother trailing behind her son to protect him at all costs, but the woman who once held the scales of justice for decades and was now forced to resurrect that version of herself at this moment. The murmurs inside seeped through the doorway like a cold draft, but I didn't let them reach my heart. I gripped the real hard drive tightly, feeling its weight as a reminder that everything I was about to do wasn't only to save Daniel, but to tear down the stage where 2 people had arrogantly believed themselves to be directors. When the clerk pulled the door open, the white courtroom lights poured over me, revealing the black judicial robe I had just put on. I stepped inside, each step heavy like a drumbeat, echoing across the room. People turned to look. The buzz inside fractured, then fell silent, dropping to the tile floor and dissolving into a thick, stunned quiet. Emily and Clay sat at the defense table. In their eyes, I watched confusion flicker into panic, then freeze into terror when they realized the person walking in was not a lawyer, not a witness. I climbed the steps to the raised bench, my hand brushing the edge of the judge's chair, a place I had left years ago, yet now felt like it had been waiting for me all along. The officer struck his baton against the table. The courtroom held its breath as I turned to face everyone. Emily was the first to speak, though her voice trembled in broken pieces. "No, no way! You're Federal Judge Margaret Hale?" Her question cracked through the room like shattering glass. The sound wavered, sharp and disbelieving, making the entire courtroom feel as though it were trembling. Clay froze, his jaw twitching, eyes widening, as if someone had slapped him back. His usual smugness vanished entirely, replaced by a panic he couldn't hide. He stared at me like he was staring into his own verdict, as if a single strike of my gavel could drop him into a bottomless pit. I didn't answer Emily. I didn't need to. I adjusted my robe, sat in the chair, and felt the solidity against my back like an old truth settling in. The silence stretched taut as a string about to snap. Every gaze anchored itself on me, as though the room was waiting for its first breath to be granted. I lifted the gavel. My fingers tightened around the wooden handle, the familiarity returning as though I had never left. The first strike echoed. The room jolted. The trial for the money laundering operation of Emily Carter and Officer Clay Morgan begins. That sound pierced through the false reality the two of them had crafted. Emily exhaled sharply, her shoulders trembling. Clay swallowed, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. But what truly detonated the room wasn't the gavel. It was the realization that the woman they thought they could threaten, humiliate, and bury was the one person with the authority to send them to the very bottom, legally, publicly, irrevocably. I locked eyes with Emily. A pale greenish tint spread across her skin as if the blood had retreated from her veins. She opened her mouth, searching for something to cling to, but no words emerged. Then I turned to Clay. For a split second, he didn't look like the swaggering, abusive officer he once was. He looked like a shadow stripped bare, with nowhere left to hide. I set the gavel down. My hands rested on the bench as I surveyed the growing chaos tightening across the room. I could feel the heartbeat of every person present sinking lower, bracing for the next tremor. Emily clutched the edge of the defense table, her breath breaking apart. I saw her shoulders collapse, her whole frame softening, as if her legs could no longer hold her weight. Just as I prepared to read the formal opening statement, Emily collapsed, her face turning as pale as paper, sending ripples of tense whispers erupting through the courtroom like sparks about to ignite. Emily was lifted back into her seat, but her eyes stayed wide, as if she was forcing her brain to believe that the woman sitting on the judge's bench was not me. Panic rippled across her shoulders. Clay remained frozen, his face ashen, avoiding my gaze, yet exposing more fear with every attempt to look away. I tapped the gavel lightly, the sound small but sharp like a lash, instantly slicing through every whisper in the room. The air inside the courtroom turned still, like water frozen over, waiting for the slightest impact to shatter it. I read the indictment, each word dropping like a stone thrown across a calm lake. Emily bowed her head, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Clay stayed quiet, but his eyes flickered toward the doors, still hoping someone would storm in and pull him out of the reach of the law. I looked at both of them, then opened the file Brooks had given me, turning to the page that listed every tainted dollar flowing through the accounts. Defendant Emily Carter, I called, my voice low but crisp. Answer one question. Emily lifted her head shakily. I leaned forward, placing my finger on the bolded line in the financial report. The $300,000 in your secondary account. Where did it come from? The question slammed into the room like a sudden blow. Emily stiffened, her eyes widening, as if she had been stripped bare before everyone. Her breath caught sharp and unsteady. She looked around, searching for Clay, searching for a lifeline, searching for anyone. But Clay looked away, abandoning her, as if she were a worthless object he no longer needed. The silence dragged, draining the color from Emily's face. Her mask peeled away layer by layer under the weight of the truth pressing down on her. I'll repeat the question. Where did the money come from? She broke into tears, her voice cracking as though someone's hands were closing around her throat. I don't remember." A blatant lie. Sharp murmurs flared through the courtroom. I struck the gavel again to restore order, then turned my gaze toward Clay. Clay shot a glance at me, then at Emily, then forced himself to lean back with an air of defiant calm he no longer possessed. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, 3 officers entered from behind. I had signaled for them earlier. One officer announced, his voice booming like a drumbeat of final judgment. "Officer Clay Morgan, you are under arrest for abuse of authority, corruption, and aiding criminal activity." Clay shot up from his chair. "What? You can't do this." But the moment he lifted his arm, it was twisted behind his back. The clank of handcuffs locking shut echoed through the courtroom, sharp enough to make Emily and several spectators flinch. Clay looked over his shoulder at me as he was dragged away, rage and desperation tangled in his eyes. "You did this! You set all this up!" I held his gaze and replied simply, "You did it to yourself." He was escorted out of the courtroom, leaving behind a vacuum of silence and the lingering scent of fear. Emily collapsed into sobs. She slid down the table leg, gripping it as though clinging to it might keep her from being swept away next. "Margaret, please don't let them put me in prison. I'm still young. I have a future." I watched her quietly. In that fragile moment, I saw no mastermind, no cruel woman who slapped me at the courthouse gate, no schemer who tried to bury my son alive. I saw a hollow soul stripped of her illusions. But justice cannot be built on pity. I answered her in the calmest tone I could summon. "I'm not taking revenge. I'm restoring justice." The words fell like a final stone, sealing the door she had tried so desperately to keep open. Emily's sobs broke into harsher, jagged sounds, as though guilt and fear were being dragged out of her by force. I set the gavel down, preparing to move to the next phase of the trial. At that moment, the door behind the witness stand opened with a soft click, followed by slow, steady footsteps entering the courtroom. I looked up. Daniel was walking toward the witness stand. His face still carried traces of fear, but his eyes were different. No longer lowered, no longer afraid of Clay, no longer blinded by the loyalty he once felt toward Emily. He stood tall, his gaze shifting from me to Emily. Daniel placed his hand on the Bible, ready to swear in and testify against the very woman who had tried to destroy his life. Daniel placed his hand on the Bible, the courtroom lights reflecting across his face, no longer trembling like that morning when he was dragged into the preliminary hearing, but steady like someone who had decided to save himself. I looked at my son, my heart aching and swelling with pride at once. He took a deep breath, then spoke the sentence that plunged the entire courtroom into absolute silence. "I want a divorce, and I am testifying against Emily Carter." Those words fell like a blade, cutting the final thread between 2 people who once called each other husband and wife. Emily froze, her reddened eyes fixed on Daniel as if begging for something she had already destroyed with her own hands. Daniel did not look back. He stood at the witness stand with his back straight, his voice even, every sentence like lifting another weight off his chest. He recounted how Emily coerced, manipulated, and deceived. How she funneled dirty money into his secondary account and pinned the crime on him. How she used Clay to clear the path, crafting a trap so precise that anyone could have been killed by it. Each word Daniel spoke sliced through the layers of lies, suffocating the courtroom. Emily burst into tears, pleading, but I held the rhythm of the trial firm as stone. Justice cannot bend toward the tears of the guilty. When Daniel stepped down, Brooks approached, placing a weathered envelope into my hand. "Your husband asked me to keep this," he said quietly. "He believed you would rise at the right moment." I stared at him, stunned. My hand trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in the familiar handwriting of the man I had loved all my life. Margaret, if a day comes when you must face the dark, remember that justice never leaves you. It only waits for you to be strong enough to call it. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, letting the warmth of memory settle over me like a light blanket in winter. When I opened them, my heart felt clear, as if no corner of the courtroom remained in shadow. I raised the gavel and pronounced judgment. Emily Carter, 18 years in federal prison for financial misconduct, fabrication of evidence, and conspiracy. Emily collapsed into her chair sobbing, but her tears now echoed like rain hitting roof tiles, unable to move anyone. I turned to the second file. Officer Clay Morgan, 22 years in federal prison for abuse of authority, corruption, fabrication of evidence, and witness intimidation. Clay, stripped of swagger, stripped of power, bowed his head like a man who finally realized the empire he built had turned to ash under the weight of his own crimes. Then I turned to Daniel. The court declares Daniel Carter fully exonerated. Daniel sank into his seat, covering his face as a sob of relief broke free. I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the familiar warmth of the boy who once clung to my hand on the playground. When I stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight hit my face brighter than any day before. I lifted my head, breathing in air that felt lighter, cleaner, as though the world itself had shifted to make room for peace in my chest. Brooks walked past me, nodding gently. Daniel followed behind, his eyes filled with respect and gratitude. I touched the pocket where my husband's letter rested, feeling his presence beside me. Justice doesn't sleep, I told Daniel, my voice soft but firm as stone. It only waits for someone strong enough to strike the gavel. As I stepped down the courthouse stairs, a black car pulled up. The door opened, and a stranger stepped out, fixing their eyes on me as if this story was not entirely finished.